Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. The subject of today's podcast is the Roman Emperor Tiberius. He was the second emperor of Rome, following on from Augustus. And Tiberius hasn't had a good press over the years, not least because our main sources, Tacitus and Suetonius, they both clearly detest him. And they accuse him of hypocrisy, of secret hatreds, of arranging a series of judicial executions which eventually morph into a reign of terror after the fall of his lieutenant Sejanus, in whom he had placed a huge amount of trust. And then, of course, there are the numerous stories of his petty cruelties and his sexual depravities on the island of Capri towards the end of his reign. But in spite of all this, I've actually always had a bit of a soft spot for Tiberius, because although the sources sort of paint him as this monster of depravity, they all seem to agree that he had a lot of really good points. For example, there's his incredible record as a commander of the Roman armies. And again you're struck by his intelligence and his just straightforward common sense when you read his speeches to the Senate. And regarding his supposed sexual depravities, well, one of my favorite general histories of Rome is a book called An Atlas of the Roman World by Tim Cornwell and John Matthews. And they say, and I'll quote because I've written it down, they say that these can be set aside as the free invention of sources who knew that they could not be refuted and that nobody would wish to try. So my thought was, well, maybe the sources are just simply wrong or particularly biased for some reason. And I was also quite influenced by a monograph I came across many years ago by a man called Norman Douglas. And he gave what I thought was a really convincing defense of Tiberius. And then, unfortunately, when I was doing my research for this podcast, I was checking back on the monograph, and I discovered that Douglas, who by the way was something of a literary giant in his day, back in the early 1900s, well, Douglas was in fact an unconcealed paedophile and pederast on a truly massive scale. So it wasn't exactly great that one of the best defenders of Tiberius that I'd found was in fact guilty of some of the crimes of which Tiberius himself is accused. You know, not just guilty, but absolutely shamelessly so. And I'll link to an article I found about Douglas written by Rachel Hope Cleaves, which I found as disturbing in a way as it was interesting. All that aside, Tiberius is a truly fascinating person. He was an enormously consequential figure in Roman history right at the start of the imperial period. So I've invited Professor Ed Watts to help untangle fact from fiction here, so far as that's possible. Ed is a professor of history at the University of California, San Diego, and the author of many books on the Roman Empire, some of which we have discussed here on the podcast before. And in fact, last time Ed was on, we engaged in some light revisionist history where he argued that Julius Caesar is in fact less of a villain than many modern historians like to paint him. So I'll be particularly interested in his verdict on Tiberius. Anyway, and sorry for the super long drawn-out introduction, welcome back, Ed, to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to take our turn at trying to rehabilitate or at least think in new ways about Tiberius.
So I'm always a bit unsure when we do these podcasts just how much background knowledge we should assume in the listeners. I'm interested in Roman history and I've read a fair bit, so I sort of know who Tiberius was and where he fits in. And I'm sure quite a lot of the listeners will too, but equally I guess quite a lot of people really won't know too much about him. So is it worth just starting with a very high level view of who Tiberius is and where we are now in the history of Rome?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think actually the way that I would probably try to do that is by introducing Tiberius as a person and getting at kind of what I think his character and basic objectives are, and situating that in the moment where he's living. So Tiberius is the last Roman emperor born before the Republic falls. And I think that's important to understand. So Augustus, of course, is born before the Republic falls. But Augustus is 19 years old when Caesar's killed. And, most of his life, he lives to be 76, is spent either fighting civil wars to establish a regime he'll be in charge of or establishing that regime. And because he lives for so long, there is not another generation of people who were born during any sort of semblance of the Republic except for Tiberius. And Tiberius was born during the moments of conflict. He was not born, before Julius Caesar's assassination, but he at least knew about what the world's shape was before Augustus reshaped it. And so he had a set of expectations that in some ways I think correspond more to the way senators and elites in the Republic understood their obligations and their roles in Roman society. And if we use that as our starting point, I think we actually have a very different portrait of this individual. Because what Tiberius believed is service to the Roman state was, in a sense, an obligation for every Roman citizen. But there are ways in which one serves the Roman state, not as someone who serves it forever and dominates it, but they serve it in the capacity to which they are capable of making the state better. And it is not a lifetime service obligation. So senators in the Roman Republic would, take positions, serve in offices, get elected to magistracies, and then take time off. This was something that was called otium, where you would serve as governor of whatever province. And then you were supposed to come back and just take some time off, both to rebuild your own sort of stability and sense of self, and also to just sort of refresh yourself. So when you got back into government service, you could do that. Tiberius, I think, understood imperial power in those terms. Augustus didn't, right? Augustus understood imperial power as something that he needs to hold for his entire life, because otherwise someone will kill him because he has done bad things. And also, he believes the state will fall apart if he's not there to secure it. Tiberius's view, I think, is a little more like what a Roman magistrate in the Republic would have thought. Tiberius did not believe that holding imperial power should be something he should do forever. And once we understand that, the mystery of Tiberius begins to become, I think, much more comprehensible. His goal was to serve for as long as he could and then step aside and retire. And he really did believe this. He really did want to do this. And he said multiple times as emperor, that's my goal, right? I will serve for a little while. I'll prepare the next generation, and then I'm out. Let me live my life. Let me be a senator. Let me, function in the capacity that Roman elites have always functioned. If that vision had actually happened, the Roman Empire would be a very different kind of place. But I think, like we talked about with Caesar, I think, had very firm convictions about how the state should work and what the limits of his actions should be. So did Tiberius. And the problem that we run into is the people writing about Tiberius are writing about Tiberius in this moment where they are, in a sense, channeling the Emperor Domitian, who's lived 70 years after Tiberius is going through this, and writing about Tiberius in a way that's supposed to reflect on conditions of the later part of the first century and early part of the second century. And so they do not understand or refuse to acknowledge that there is actually a real logic to what Tiberius is doing. He really does believe, yes, he has a role to play, and Roman society needs him to play this role, but other people should play a role too. And it is not appropriate, and it's not good, and it's not good for Rome or for him to serve as the leader of this state for his entire life. Once we see that, we can start to understand some of the conduct and some of the behavior and some of the stuff that just looks plain weird when people 100 years later are writing about it.
But what about the sources? Because we've got Tacitus and we've got Suetonius, right? And they really, really seem to detest him. And I can't believe this is just down to sort of a reflection of Domitian. When you read Tacitus in particular, he reports Tiberius doing really quite sensible things, saying extremely sensible things, and then saying, but this was the better to conceal, his hatred of whoever. And you just think, this is nuts.
Yeah, well, I don't think people liked him. And I think actually for people running any kind of organization, from an academic department to a company to, a massive state of 60 million people, there's a difference between being capable and being well-liked. He was not well-liked. I think a big part of why he was not well-liked is people didn't understand what he was trying to do. It didn't make sense to them. that Tiberius a couple of times effectively retired from the city of Rome and asserted his right to otium, right? That didn't make sense to them because Augustus never did that, and no emperor after him did that. So, so when people like Tacitus and Suetonius are looking at him, they just can't understand this. And so when Tiberius says, upon taking power, I want to basically hold this power kind of in trust for the next generation. And when they're ready, I'm going to step aside. Tacitus and Suetonius both read that as, effectively Tiberius is lying and he's trying to trap people. And he's trying to see who's going to rise up to seize that power so he can stamp them down. And it's like he's playing a long game of chess where he's, putting something out there to see who's going to try to take it so he can eventually snap back at you. But if you actually say, no, take him at his word, then all of a sudden what they are saying about this is some, secret, like really complicated trap doesn't make sense. But also most of the senators that Tiberius is working with were born under Augustus. He's a lot older than them. And so they don't work in a world that Tiberius thinks still exists. They don't know that world. That world is not their reality. And so when Tiberius says things like, yeah, I want to step aside, they don't believe him either. And they think he's lying. I don't think he's lying. I think his conduct actually shows he meant what he said. He really did believe that this was for the best of Rome, and he tried to live it. And people just would not accept that he's actually telling them the truth about what he wants to do. And then that gets baked into our sources. But there is one other thing that I do want to just say about that, that I think is always important when we're talking about Roman emperors and their subsequent reputation. The Emperor Hadrian, in some ways, actually is very similar to Tiberius in that, Hadrian was very capable, but not very well liked. And when Hadrian dies, the Emperor Antoninus Pius takes power after him. And Pius is very well liked. And there's a meeting in the Senate where Pius proposes making Hadrian a god. And the senators don't want to do it. They don't like Hadrian. They don't want to make him a god. And they have reasons to object. There were some executions of senators early in Hadrian's reign and late in Hadrian's reign. But what Pius basically says is, you know what, like you do this or I'm out. He puts everything on the line to make it so that the Senate divinizes Hadrian. And the Senate basically says that's not a fight. We don't want to have the fight that badly. So, okay, fine. We'll divinize Hadrian. What ends up happening is Pius reigns for like 23 years. He's a very successful emperor. He's followed by Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius reigns for another 17 years. He's the most well-esteemed and successful emperor. And Hadrian gets basically kind of whitewashed in this. And so Hadrian is the third of the 5 good emperors. Except there was a real argument about whether you were going to condemn Hadrian when Hadrian died. So when Tiberius dies, there's an argument in the Senate about whether he should be made a god. And Caligula advances this idea, and there's resistance in the Senate. And Caligula ultimately says, you know what, like this is not worth the political capital it's going to take. So he lets the idea drop. And so Tiberius falls out of that, in the way that Hadrian did not, just because of a decision made by his successor. And then his successor turns out to be a terrible emperor. And so you never get a rehabilitation of Tiberius. But if you look at the ways Romans talk about the legitimate emperors who reigned in an effective way, when the Emperor Vespasian takes power in 70, we have the law that is issued to extend power to him. And it defines his powers. And it defines his powers in accordance with the powers exercised by Augustus, who was a god, Claudius, who was a god, and Tiberius. And so Tiberius is actually seen in a legal context and in a sort of symbolic context as somebody who did reign effectively and capably. But he isn't given the sort of ultimate honor, which frees him up to be attacked in the way that Tacitus and Suetonius do.
So this is just a little bit of a digression, but what do the Romans understand when they divinize an emperor? I mean, what does it mean to become a god as far as they're concerned?
I think we can't really say what it means, but we can say what it does. So if you're made a god, there is a temple, either that you share with somebody else or a temple full stop. And then in the holidays, the calendar of holidays in the city of Rome, you are remembered. And there's a priest who's dedicated to your memory. and you have holidays that are devoted to, commemorating your achievements and your deeds. And so you enter into a kind of level of memory, like civic memory, where your actions and your achievements are repeated in a fashion, that is pretty regular. It happens annually at least. And there's a site where people can go and kind of honor you. It just means that there is a maintenance of a particular idea of who you were, whereas someone like Tiberius doesn't get that, right? And so your reputation and your deeds and your actions become more malleable because there isn't this potted history of all the good that you did.
And it's not then like, say, purgatory, where where people are saying prayers for your soul, which is helping you to advance faster to heaven. It's not that kind of idea, which we get from in Catholic Christianity.
I don't know enough about what they're actually doing in these, are people actually going to Claudius and in like 300 and praying for something? I don't know. We don't know that. But I think that what you run into is the state pays money to preserve the fond memory of these emperors for hundreds of years. And Tiberius doesn't get that. But it's interesting because I don't think Tiberius wanted that. When he becomes emperor, there are moves to try to build temples to him and to his genius. And he's like, I don't want that. You can do it for Augustus. Don't do it for me. I don't want it. And so, that is, I think, part of why Caligula probably let this matter drop. It actually wasn't that important to Tiberius. He didn't really care.
Which, again, is part of his good sense. But you mentioned Augustus. So Tiberius is very much part of the imperial family for many years before becoming emperor, but he's not related. Well, he's not directly related to Augustus. So can you just explain for people how he came to be part of Augustus's family, and what was the relationship? How did they get on, Augustus and Tiberius?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story because Augustus, his first wife, he divorces her in the context of the civil wars with Antony, and he marries Livia. Now, Livia, this is the second marriage for Livia, and Tiberius and Tiberius's brother Drusus were actually the children of this first marriage of Livia. And so Augustus does have a daughter, Julia, but he adopts the two sons that Livia had in their first marriage and brings them into a kind of blended family. What Augustus really believes his family serves to do is, they serve basically as placeholders who can function in creating an administrative structure that will not challenge his power. And so Augustus's first choice for his successor, who's found in the 20s, is actually married to Augustus's daughter, Julia. And they have a number of children. And Tiberius is allowed to actually marry in a way that would be a kind of appropriate senatorial marriage. So he marries a woman named Vespania, who is the granddaughter of one of Cicero's friends, a man named Atticus. And this is a loving marriage. Now she's a daughter of Agrippa, so there is a tie back to Agrippa, but she's the granddaughter of Atticus. And so you have here someone with a republican lineage, and Tiberius is functioning as like a prominent senator would, building diplomatic alliances that help the next generation. And that seems to be fine, and that marriage actually seems to be a loving marriage. But eventually Agrippa dies well before Augustus dies, and Augustus needs to find a new generation of successors. He does not have a male son, so he moves to his stepsons. And he forces Tiberius to divorce this woman that he loved, with whom he had a child, and to marry Augustus's daughter, Julia, the widow of Agrippa and Tiberius's, stepsister, which is about as gross as it sounds. Tiberius is, the sources are kind of mixed about this. They say that Julia actually did kind of have a crush on Tiberius. And that makes sense. Tiberius is he's a very, very effective military commander. He is accomplished. In the portraits that we see of him, it's always hard to tell what you see with Roman portraits, but the portraits of him when he's relatively young and he looks relatively attractive, like it would make sense. but he's still heartbroken over this divorce. And Augustus sees these two individuals just as like chess pieces. He doesn't really care how they feel or how they think. And so Augustus just wants them to do what Augustus wants them to do without complaint and without question and without like doing anything other than the role that Augustus has decided for them to play.
But then he sort of set up this role to play, but then Augustus, not immediately, but quite soon after, he says, I've had enough. Well, I guess he's been commanding the armies for quite a long time. So he's exhausted from doing that, I guess. And then he's married to Julia, and that's not worked. And so he says, right, stuff this. I'm off the roads.
Right. Yeah, no, this is Tiberius acting like a senator, right? This is Tiberius acting like somebody in the Republic. So Augustus makes him divorce a woman he loves, puts him together with a woman he doesn't love, probably didn't like, but definitely didn't love. And then basically says to Tiberius, okay, so you're, now the likely heir designate, go off and fight my wars. And so there's no time for him to get to know his wife. His wife feels kind of betrayed by this. She starts having affairs. How many, we don't know. The sources, I think, over amplify the infidelity that she has. But what Augustus has basically done is taken a mature woman who is the widow of somebody who she did seem to have, at least a strong relationship with, and then within a year forces her to marry her stepbrother, and then sends the stepbrother away for years. So the marriage degenerates before it really even starts. And in the meantime, Tiberius is fighting very difficult wars under very difficult conditions, and not getting, and all the credit ultimately goes to Augustus. So there's a wonderful cameo that shows the Tiberius in triumph after one of his German victories. And so cameo is, it's like a precious stone with sort of like a glass overlay that is then carved to show figures in a particular scene. And Tiberius is in his triumphal chariot being crowned, but actually he's off to the left side. The center figure in this is Augustus. Even though Augustus just, sat in Rome drinking wine and eating like fine foods, and Tiberius is sitting in the snow fighting the Germans. Tiberius gets kind of off to the side. And I think Tiberius just gets sick of it. He's like, you ruined my life. We have sources that talk about him, seeing Vespania on the street and, and going up to her and saying like, I'm so, so, so sad that this happened. Please take me back. And Augustus actually has to then use his proto-secret service to keep Tiberius from ever seeing Vespania again. And so, of course, Tiberius is burned out. And so in 6 BC, he asks Augustus to retire, to have otium, like a senator should. And Augustus says no. So Tiberius starts starving himself. And eventually Livia goes to Augustus. Augustus probably would have let him starve himself. Eventually Livia goes to Augustus and says, you know what, like, what's the point? Just let him go. And so he goes off to Rhodes and then eventually just divorces Julia. And Augustus turns to the next generation. So you have Augustus, the generation of Augustus's kids. The next generation is Augustus's grandchildren. And there are 2 princes who had been born to Julia from that first marriage with Agrippa, who Augustus then appoints the heirs. And so you've basically, Tiberius, because he threw a fit, the generation gets skipped. And then these 2 princes are the heirs designate. And Tiberius is allowed to go to Rhodes.
And is that dangerous for Tiberius that these 2, that the younger generation have sort of walked past him? Are they going to be able to tolerate keeping him around if they do succeed? Is he going to get paranoid about this, or what's his feeling about that? Because initially he's going to say, "Great, I don't want it," but
I think that's really hard to say. I think that what we know the empire to be wasn't a fixed thing at the moment that Tiberius is doing this. And Tiberius's ideas, I don't think are realistic. but I think that he does believe that the empire is something different than it turns out to be. He really does believe that actually what we have kind of done with Augustus is we've shifted things so that now actually decision making that in the Republic lay with this kind of intersection of people voting for representatives and a tension between what the people want and what the representatives do. Now we've basically moved to a system where there's somebody guaranteeing the peace, and then the Senate basically is running things. And so when Tiberius is emperor, he takes a number of steps to make it clear that's what he thinks. He gets rid of popular elections of magistrates because he thinks, what's the point? He lets the senators appoint the magistrates because he wants the Senate to more or less run the state in coordination with the emperor. And that's what I think he believes this system either is or could be, because it's what Augustus says it is. It isn't, but it's what Augustus says it is. And so I think that Tiberius genuinely believed, like, I'm in Rhodes and I'm retired. Why would they care about me? Could it have happened? I don't know. I don't know. But I think it's much more likely they'll fight each other than that they'll worry about the previous generation, because he really is out of the box.
There's a nice story while he's on Rhodes, and I've no idea if it's true or not. It has sort of the feel of a fable. But there's a nice story on Rhodes where he asked to visit some hospital where the sick people are, and he asked to meet the sick people. And instead of sort of going around to see them in their beds, they're all promptly turned out into the courtyard and I think arranged alphabetically by illness. he's absolutely horrified. This wasn't what he intended at all. I have no idea if this is true or not. I'm not even quite sure where I got the story from, but I thought it was absolutely terrific.
You have these stories of Tiberius that just correlates with what Tiberius is doing, right? Like, he thinks he lives in one world, everybody else lives in another one, and nobody understands why the expectations don't match. And it happens again and again and again with him, where, he thinks that he's actually being somebody who is the kind of a senator who's the first among equals. And he wants the Senate to behave that way. And so when they conduct trials, he's like scrupulous about saying, look, like, however I vote should not affect how you vote. There's, if somebody's my friend and they're convicted or they're charged with a crime, that it doesn't matter that they're my friend. And everybody else is like, this is a trap, I don't know if it happened, but it is totally on brand that something like that would happen, where Tiberius would come with, like, a gentle heart wanting to see the sick that he can help. And instead there's this whole, like, orchestration of, like, horribleness, just because there's a disconnect between the world he thinks he's living in and the world that actually is.
We kind of mentioned the fact that Augustus has got one view of things and Tiberius has another idea, and maybe the Senate has another idea. But part of the problem, isn't it, is that Augustus is the first emperor. And so there's absolutely no precedence. And also Augustus has been lying his head off about what the system really is. But Tiberius, he's quite old, right, when Augustus finally dies. I think he's in his late 50s.
And worn out. I think it's in Tiberius's case. I mean, your 50s is old for a Roman, but Tiberius has a lot of miles on him too. You know, he's like the 30-year-old Toyota with 300,000 miles. Like, it's old, but it's also worn out.
There's another incredible story about him, where his brother Drusus has died, fighting in I think in Germany. And Tiberius rushes, hundreds of miles, gallops hundreds of miles to try and get there before the end. And then when the end comes, he escorts the body of his brother back to Rome, and he walks beside the corpse the entire way. I mean, these guys must have been absolutely tough as anything.
Oh my God, yeah. No, that generation is insane. So Tiberius is the first of the two, but Drusus is a very formidable person. I mean, Drusus, even now in Mainz, there's a monument to Drusus. It's like a 60-foot tall kind of tower. It's 2,000 years old, and this was put up because the troops respected Drusus so much. And Drusus is, Tiberius campaigns very effectively in Germany, but Drusus is more effective even. And he's the one who pushes so deeply into Germany that for a time, Romans entertained the idea of the Elbe, not the Rhine, being the border, because Drusus is able to penetrate and conquer so deeply, that you extend kind of not from the very edge of Germany now, but to the very sort of core of Germany. And when he dies because it's an accident. He falls from his horse, he gets an infection, and he lasts for about a month afterwards. But Tiberius does get to him. But Drusus, I think it's very hard to say, but I would imagine that Drusus has a very similar sense to what Tiberius has of what it's like to live under Augustus. I think Suetonius tells us that Drusus actually wrote something to Tiberius complaining about how Augustus was running things. But these guys were tyrannized by their stepfather, and Drusus dies because of it. But the kind of demands that you're putting on these men is insane. And to say nothing about what it means in an ancient context where you don't understand how infections work, you don't know about microbes, and you go from Rome to Germany, you go through all of these different kind of small ecosystems of microbes, you go through all of these different places where you're drinking water with stuff in it that your body's never encountered, you're eating food that your body's never encountered, you're sleeping in the rough, more or less. I mean, they're not sleeping on the ground, but they're sleeping in tents. They're dealing with really rough climate. There's a lot of travel. There's a lot of moving around, not a lot of rest. And they get sick. And when they get sick in these conditions, they fear that somebody's trying to poison them because, of course, they don't know what's going on. And so when Augustus is sending them around doing these things, it's not just the stress of the travel and the fact that you're fighting wars and the fact that you're potentially, going to die in ambushes in forests in Germany or die of the cold because you're from Italy and you've never experienced anything like this. It's also this fear that somebody might try to do you in, even though nobody's trying to do you in. It looks like it, it feels like it. And there's this fear among this kind of generation. And Germanicus, who we haven't talked about, is another example of this.
We'll come to him in a bit because I think that's a very, very good example of what you're talking about.
But but they would understand things that we know have nothing to do with people, as things that are coming from the malicious intent of people. And Augustus is putting them in a position where all of this is happening all the time. It is going to break. It would break anybody.
Yeah.
And so the fact that, Tiberius loses Drusus, who's the only person in the world who has any sense of what he's going through, I think it is a very profound loss to him.
And then, as I understand it, Augustus has now, using Drusus, he's effectively conquered Germany.
Yeah.
And so now, they're stationing legions there, but they're stationing there to keep the peace, not to affect the conquest, as I understand it. And that's at this stage, these legions are led by a man called Varus, and they're betrayed and ambushed and wiped out completely by the Germans led by Arminius. And I think it's Tiberius again that has to sort of step up and sort it out, right?
Yeah, well, so the intervening point in this is Tiberius retires to Rhodes. This next generation comes in, and they both die. Augustus does the same thing to them that he had done to Tiberius and Drusus. Right? Go, be the imperial representative where big things are happening. They both die. And so again, like you have this sense, what happened? How did they die? What was the cause? It doesn't matter because now you have to go back to Tiberius. And so Tiberius is eventually recalled. So the second of these grandsons dies in 4 AD. Tiberius is recalled within, a couple months. And so he's back in the sequence in June of 4. And then he's told to adopt Germanicus. So he is the successor to Augustus. and Germanicus is going to be the next sort of level.
And just remind me, who is Germanicus? Where does he come from?
So there's a line of Augustus when he was still working with Antony. Antony had married Octavia, who was Augustus's sister, and Germanicus comes from that line.
Okay.
And so he's part of the imperial family, but he's not, he's not of the direct line that Gaius and Lucius were.
Right.
And so, so Germanicus is part of this family, and Germanicus is also a really, really capable person. This is the thing that I think, is so remarkable is he's cycling through. I mean, Gaius and Lucius, I don't think were capable people, but he's cycling through these massively accomplished, really, really good people. And they all just keep dying, right? Like Drusus could have run the empire. It would have been probably good. Tiberius, I think he did the best he could, given that Augustus had broken him. Germanicus, I think, would have been an exceptional emperor, right? These are all people who would do a very good job. Agrippa before them, I think, would have done a very good job. Augustus had a whole line of people who could have taken over and done a good job. But what happens with Varus is Augustus believes that basically Germania is pacified. Like he believes that what you need to do is move from a military governor and a military sort of figure who's just basically marching the armies around to suppress people to somebody who can build a civilian infrastructure. And Varus is not a general, right? He is not Drusus. He's not Tiberius. He's not Germanicus. Like he is not, that's not his skill set. He's more of a civilian general who's now supposed to use the legions to kind of keep the peace, but build up a civilian infrastructure. And when there's a rebellion that emerges, Varus gets it in his head that like he needs to suppress this dramatically and violently and quickly. And so this is why he runs into this trap. He's not really a very skilled military commander. And Augustus had assumed that you didn't need one there at that point. And so what you have is a mismatch of skill and, the needs of the state. And it's catastrophic because at Teutoburg Forest, it's a battle that like spins out over a number of days. Varus sort of stumbles into being kind of too aggressive in a way that tactically didn't make any sense and just getting completely destroyed. And it's a disaster.
I never quite understand this. The story is that Augustus is left growing his hair, refusing to cut his hair, wandering through the palace shouting, "Varus, Varus, give me back my legions." And I think back to the Republic. And I think, Hannibal, he's culling, 5 legions here, 3 legions there. Crassus loses any number when he marches off to Parthia. Even Caesar, he loses a legion or 2 in Gaul. And all of a sudden, oh my God, we can't cope with the loss of 3 legions. And I'm just thinking, what on earth changed? I mean, before, nobody would even have noticed the loss of 3 legions.
So I think there's a couple things that have changed. I mean, first, these are professional soldiers. The levies in the Republic were not. If you think of like the difference between the people being just sort of rushed into Ukrainian cannon fire by the Russians right now versus, say, a U.S. Army battalion, right? The U.S. Army battalions are made up of people who are very well trained. They are professional soldiers. And because of that, there are skills that are acquired over time, and there's capacity to fight that is improved. And you lose all of that time and training when those people die versus sending raw recruits out. You train them for 2 weeks, you send them out. There's large numbers of them, but they don't fight particularly well. And so there's a moment in the later Republic where you can really see this. So this is a battle that takes place right after Antony's consulship ends in 44 BC. And he is going to go try to assume control over a territory in Italy that's held by one of the conspirators who assassinated Julius Caesar. And what Antony gets is a veteran legion. And he goes and he besieges the city. And one of the consuls for the next year, for 43, goes with a fresh group of draftees. And they take the field against Antony, and Antony just sort of cuts them to pieces. But then Augustus, then called Octavian, joins the battle with a group of Caesarian veterans. And they cut Antony's troops to pieces just as easily as Antony cut the draftees to pieces. And and Augustus is there, right? So what Augustus realizes there, and I think everybody kind of realized, was Caesar's veterans, they are hardcore. They are really real. They have lots of experience. They do not flinch when they're under fire. They sort of do, on a sort of hardwired way, the stuff that recruits have to think to do. And their quality is so superior that their quality offsets any kind of quantity that you could just mobilize through citizen levies. And the resulting kind of civil war that unfolds shows the great advantage of having professional troops. And so what Augustus basically decides to do is use the resources that he personally controls to create professional armies that are loyal to him directly, because he understands that if he has these professional armies, even if the Senate were to mobilize every single person in Rome who's not in those armies, Augustus would win that war. And probably those other armies wouldn't even fight, because this is, in essence, the difference between raw recruits in Ukraine and like US special forces, right? Like you can have more, but they're not going to win. And so when Augustus loses those troops, he isn't just losing the men, he's losing the years that it took to build those men. And that's not replaceable. And so when you look at like subsequent Roman history, you see these moments where, you have losses in plague, or you have losses in battles, or, there are a number of these that you can think about, like the loss by Decius of an entire army to the Goths, or the Battle of Adrianople, where the Eastern Roman field army is destroyed. And you do have moments where the state tries to rebuild those armies. I mean, after the Battle of Adrianople in 378, the Emperor Theodosius, we have sources that say he goes around and he recruits farmers and blacksmiths, and we have a panegyric that says he's going to lead these into victory against the Goths. And he leads them into battle, and the Goths just cut them to pieces because they are not professional soldiers. So that's what Varus lost. It isn't the men. Augustus, I think, was not concerned about replacing the men. But what he was concerned about replacing is, not only are these veteran soldiers, but they're some of the best soldiers, right? Because they have been fighting these campaigns in Germany. And so the loss there is basically irreplaceable.
Well, we probably, time's going by, so we probably ought to get to Tiberius the Emperor.
Yeah.
So what to say about Augustus has died. Tiberius presents himself to the Senate, and almost immediately he says, I don't really want to be emperor exactly. You do part of the job, I'll do another part, and we'll work it out together. And so how does that play out?
Yeah, it doesn't play out well. It's his idea. It's his notion of what the state should be and how it should work. And he also tells the Senate, I'm not going to do this for life. I'm going to do it for a short time. We'll cycle to somebody else. What's interesting about the sources that talk about Tiberius is during this period of time where he is announcing these things, he's ruling very well. Because he's actually expecting, okay, so I have like a term, right? I'm going to serve a term. I'm going to do what I want to do in this term. When the term ends, Germanicus will take over, and then all will be good. And when Tiberius does take power, Germanicus, it's very clear, is going to be the successor. And then Tiberius's son from his first wife, who is also named Drusus, because Romans like to confuse us, he is named basically like the next in line, the spare after Germanicus. And it looks totally like Tiberius is going to manage to do this. But then Germanicus dies in 19, and it's Tiberius and Drusus. And
well, let's just talk about Germanicus's death, because that is that's one of the great stories. And I just want to add, before we talk about Germanicus, I just want to bring up a quote, which I was, again, preparing for the podcast, and I was reading Mommsen. And he says that women disliked Tiberius, and to rule Rome without the favor of women was impossible. And I was very struck looking at the story of Germanicus, who is always trying to conquer Germany until Tiberius says, look, maybe it's just not doable. Let's try something else. So he sends Germanicus off to the east to sort out various problems they have out there. And at the same time, there's the governor of Syria is appointed. You have Germanicus's wife and you have Piso's wife, and they loathe each other. and they seem to be part of what goes wrong at this point. So do you just want to tell a little bit about the story of Germanicus being sent out to the east and what happens from there?
So basically, the model that Augustus had set up with Agrippa was Augustus and Agrippa would kind of be in different parts of the empire at a particular time, because the empire is massive, right? It's basically the size of the continental United States. And so you need to have a presence in the East because there's more money and people in the East. And so what Augustus would do is, he would go to the East sometimes and leave Agrippa in Rome. But basically, for a lot of the last part of Agrippa's life, Agrippa was in the East as the heir designate, who is a representation of imperial authority in this really big region. And Tiberius, when he actually went to Rhodes instead and retired, that's what Augustus had in mind for him, is he was going to go to the East. So sending Germanicus to the East is actually a totally sensible thing within the system of what Augustus had set up. And so you send him to the East to kind of run things as a representation of imperial power. And there's nothing nefarious about this at all. It's actually a totally normal thing to do. What Piso is supposed to do is serve as basically part of the staff that's going to help Germanicus. But what Piso decides to do instead is build up a power base that could potentially challenge Germanicus. And that was not, our sources suggest differently, but that is not Tiberius's intention at all. He has no desire or need to undermine Germanicus because, again, Tiberius wants to leave this job. If he kills Germanicus, there's no leaving. So there's no reason for him to do this. And Germanicus, of course, he's going to get the job in a couple of years anyway. There's no reason for him to do anything to try to undermine Tiberius. So the idea that there's sort of plots and counterplots among those two makes no sense. But what Piso, I think, is trying to do is somehow get rid of Germanicus and maybe slot himself in as a replacement. So I think the villain here is not Tiberius. It's not Germanicus. I think Piso is really the villain. But what ends up happening is Germanicus makes a mistake where he goes to Egypt when he wasn't supposed to. This makes Tiberius angry, not angry enough that he's going to kill him, but very soon afterwards, Germanicus dies, and people suspect that Piso had something to do with it, and he did it on Tiberius's orders because Tiberius was angry about Egypt. So the story kind of superficially makes sense, but I think, again, the main long-term goal of Tiberius is not to stay in power. He doesn't want that. And so all of these moves that later authors ascribe to him as like plots so that he can get rid of rivals and stay in power, he doesn't want that. Like, that's not his goal. So there's no way to imagine that these plots are actually what our sources are saying, because ultimately, it wouldn't make sense. It would be counterproductive to what Tiberius actually wants.
And I guess it goes back to what you were saying earlier, is that if you're out in the East, you're in, a completely different place to you're used to. Goodness knows what you're picking up by way of diseases, malaria, typhus, God knows what. And so it is completely understandable that Germanicus should fall sick, get a bit better, fall sick again. And how easy it really is to poison somebody, who doesn't want to be poisoned.
Well, nature will do it for you. You don't need to do anything. Yeah, no, I think that's a really big part of it. I think the other thing, and I think whenever you're reading about people plotting against Roman emperors, everybody in Rome understood this rule. If you try to assert power, you either win or die. If you're going to try to overthrow the emperor, you either do it or you die. So the risk of doing this when you're next in line anyway, is it's so far beyond what anybody would consider trying. There are people who are crazy enough to do it. There are people who make bad decisions with, incomprehensible reasons behind them. Germanicus is not that type of a person. And so all of the time that you see these sort of rumors about, oh, this person is going out here to build a power base to challenge somebody else, the question that we always have to sort of ask to check those stories is, well, could they get that goal with less risk? Could they achieve what you're saying they want to do without risk? For Germanicus, there is zero risk. Tiberius has been explicit about the fact that in a few years, he's going to go away. And Germanicus is that's his job. So why would Germanicus be at all interested in speeding that along when he has it anyway? He just needs to sit there and wait.
But again, it makes no sense that Piso would get involved. But what do you think this idea of Mommsen, that at this period of time that the women in Roman history are actually quite powerful and quite influential through their husbands?
I think it's true of every moment in Roman history, and it's not through their husbands. I mean that is part of how they're influential, but they're influential because they're influential. They control resources. They have people loyal to them. There are spheres of influence and ways that they can intervene in political life that men cannot. And they understand this. They understand that, yes, they cannot hold offices, and no woman actually holds executive power in the Roman state until very deep into what many people call the Byzantine Empire. But that doesn't mean they're not powerful. And it doesn't mean that they don't understand how to use that power. And there are ways that women can take public stands that influence policy in a fashion that men cannot. And there are ways that they can exercise influence in a fashion that men would be punished for exercising. And so women are always powerful in the Roman state. These women, I think one difference is, especially once you start getting into people like Agrippina's kids, Germanicus and Agrippina's kids, they believe they're bred for this. And then, in some ways they are, right? Augustus has orchestrated a whole bunch of marriages to create this family that's supposed to run the empire. And so those women, I think, believe that they have an objective to make sure that their heirs exercise power and that they serve a role to make sure that those heirs govern effectively and survive. So I think in that way, Mommsen is right. There is something different about these women of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But I think he's wrong to say there's anything specific about this or that they're doing this through their husbands.
I think, in fairness, that was my gloss. But what Mommsen said was that women disliked Tiberius, and that this added to his problems. Do you think that's just him? What do you think?
I think that there is always a challenge with people like Tiberius who outlive most of their generation. Younger women, yeah, but I don't think that's actually true of women his age. It might be, but I think Vespania really did love him. Julia, I think, actually, we're told loved him at the beginning, or wanted, like, crushed after him at least.
Yeah.
So I think it's true, definitely, of the women around him in the 20s and 30s AD. I don't think it's true, in the teens BC.
And then you talked about that Tiberius initially governs well. There's a great speech. I was sort of rereading my Tacitus, ahead of the podcast. Do you remember that speech where I think one of the magistrates is saying, wouldn't it be a great idea if we sort of prohibited excessive consumption, and brought back these sumptuary laws? And Tiberius is saying, well, that's great. You're gonna get all the credit for this wonderful law, and I'm gonna get all the blame for when it for when it's enforced. So thank you very much, but no, thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. And I think in the early phase of Tiberius's reign, there's all kinds of really smart things that he does. I think what breaks him is, so Germanicus dies in 19, and then Tiberius's son Drusus moves up to the heir, but he's the last person alive in that generation. And so Drusus is given powers, given authorities. He's it's clear that he's not only heir designate, but Tiberius is starting to step away and give him more and more responsibilities. And Tiberius is probably going to be able to escape in a couple of years. And then Drusus dies in 22, and he dies in 23. And what we're told is Tiberius, he behaves in ways that the Senate doesn't understand. He sort of throws himself into his work, but he becomes really kind of withdrawn and silent. And eventually, he leaves Rome and he moves first to Campania and then to Capri. I think if we look at this not as a political figure, but as a human being, this is somebody who has lost his wife because he's been tyrannized for his entire life by his stepfather. He's now lost his son, who he loved, and he's lost his escape from this job that he hates. of course he's going to break. He's in his 60s. Of course he's going to break. And so when he breaks, it's not that he reveals his true tyrannical self.
Mm.
It's a man who's broken. Why can he not go to Rome? Because he's burnt out. He's probably suffered deep psychological problems. And he just can't be back in the city because it triggers him. If we start looking at him as a human, this last phase of his life makes a lot of sense. And so what happens? He has to run the empire. He's not capable of doing it, but there's no one else who can step in. And so he starts ruling through surrogates because he just can't mentally do the job in the city in the way that he was doing it before. Once we sort of reshift that focus, is he on Capri so he can engage in orgies and, do all of this sort of crazy stuff while he entrusts the management of the city of Rome to Sejanus? I think he's in Capri really like healing his wounds and trying to function.
Right.
I don't think there's more to it than that.
So what's his solution to the problem? Because he can't easily run the day-to-day business of the empire from Capri. So what's his solution?
His solution is to take a delegate who is actually, a trusted sort of associate of the imperial family, a man named Sejanus, who is the head of the Praetorian Guard. And a capable man, but also a very sort of wily man who, unlike Germanicus, unlike Drusus, unlike Tiberius, right, he doesn't have a line to power. And so he starts building up supporters and sort of punishing people who might threaten his authority and his power in a fashion that ultimately redounds back onto Tiberius, because Tiberius is the one who's empowered him. And so for the better part of 5 years, Sejanus is kind of contorting this imperial system in a fashion that looks legal but really isn't, and is definitely not consistent with what Tiberius believes or wants. But Sejanus controls the flow of information to Tiberius, and so it's not really clear what Tiberius even knows about what's happening. But then in 31, it becomes clear to Tiberius what actually is going on. And Tiberius orchestrates this really wonderful counteraction to Sejanus, where there's a Senate meeting that's called, and Sejanus is summoned. And the people in the Senate meeting, we're told, expect that this is going to be where Tiberius announces that Sejanus is going to be his heir and is going to share in his powers. And so people are crowding around, being kind of these sort of like icky Olegianas, like, oh my God, Sejanus, you're the best ever, trying to kiss up to him because he's about to be named the new real power in Rome. And Tiberius starts with this speech of, here's what Sejanus has done. And it looks like that's actually where this is going to go. And then there's this pivot. And he starts denouncing Sejanus as a criminal. And ultimately, the person reading the speech says, okay, Sejanus now must be arrested. And so everybody kind of looks at the people presiding over the Senate meeting like, what do we do here? And the person presiding says, Sejanus, you have to stand up. And I think it's Tacitus says, Sejanus is not used to being told to do anything, so he doesn't stand up. And the presider says, no, up. and he stands him up, and they arrest him. And so just in the course of this one Senate meeting, you have this total kind of flip from Sejanus is expecting to be ensconced as, the supreme authority in the state to now he's arrested. Within a couple days, he's dead. And so Tiberius has executed this. This shows how smart and capable he is. It's also, in a way, a very brutal way. It's in a way kind of beautiful.
Yeah, there is a slightly sadistic feel to it. The way he starts off by praising him, and then, bit by bit, it becomes more complicated. And then by the end, it's an outright denunciation, right?
Yeah. But I think once the fall of Sejanus happens, you start getting things that from Capri look like justice and in Rome look like terror. So there is a set of trying to find the supporters of Sejanus who were either aware of the sort of maneuvering that Sejanus was doing, or would have been supportive.
You call it maneuvering, but as I understand it, Sejanus, again, it's very hard to tell with these plots, but Sejanus, really was, he may well have had Drusus killed because he was having an affair, wasn't he, with, was it with the wife of Drusus? How reliable is this?
Honestly, I don't think any of these people who are supposedly poisoned, any of these family members who are darting all around who are supposedly poisoned, I don't think any of them were poisoned.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it's this risk versus reward thing.
But you make the point, Germanicus is on the way to the top. But Sejanus, he's in a very vulnerable position because whoever succeeds, can reduce him to nothing just at a stroke of a pen.
That's true, but the game at that point is so long. Like if that was what he was trying to do, he would have to take out both Tiberius and Drusus. If you're in an exposed position and you're worried about that position, and you kill the son of the reigning emperor, and the reigning emperor finds out, or there's even a rumor of it, you're dead.
Yeah.
And so I think the risk for Sejanus, like if it had been assassins take out Tiberius and at the same time Drusus is poisoned, that's credible. But to take out the heir and not take out the person on top, there's a serious risk there. And I think most of the time you always have people who do insane things for reasons that don't make sense. I don't think Sejanus is that person. I think that the rise is very carefully calibrated, and he's figuring out what boundaries he can push and what kinds of things he can do in Tiberius's name to enhance his own position. And so it takes a while, right? I mean, it's 5 years of maneuvering.
So why on that thinking, why is Sejanus killed?
Because I think it did become clear to Tiberius that this is a real growing threat. And it is a real threat. I think Tiberius did not have enough information to understand for a lot of this because Sejanus is controlling the flow of information. We're told that the place on Capri where Tiberius is staying doesn't even have a harbor, right? So it's very hard to reach him. But information does reach him, and he begins to understand what Sejanus is doing. I don't think Sejanus even would have had Tiberius killed. I think he just would have kept marginalizing him. And then when he died, Sejanus would just up and take it.
Yeah.
And I think Tiberius realized that this was problematic. So I think what follows, though, is what really tarnishes the image of Tiberius the most, because there is these series of trials about people who are supposed to be associated with Sejanus. When historians have gone through and they've actually done a count, and I haven't done this, but I've seen some of the numbers people put out. Most of the people tried are not convicted, and a number of people commit suicide before they go on trial. But the people who go on trial, most of them who go on trial are not convicted, and so there are people who are executed for this, but there are people who are brought to trial. The evidence isn't there, and they're let go. If you're Tiberius on Capri, that's what you see, right? There were people who did bad things. There were people who were accused of doing bad things. Our justice system figured out who did bad things and who didn't. And that's how it's supposed to work. But if you're in Rome, this is a reign of terror because you don't know if you're going to be charged. You don't know if you're going to be charged and you might be convicted falsely. You don't know if the person charging you has evidence and if you didn't do anything. And so you are terrified. It's not so much the verdict as it is the process. And so Tiberius is not in Rome. He doesn't understand this.
And possibly by this stage, he doesn't actually care so much because he's had enough, right?
I don't think he cares about the people, but I still think he cares about the principle. I think he's had enough of these people, right? I mean, it's clear they don't like him. He doesn't like them. But I think he does still believe in this principle that this should work in a certain way, right? There are rules about what should happen.
It's very interesting you say that because I've often wondered, well, to deal with Sejanus, why doesn't he just invite him to Capri and have him murdered? And there's a sense that he thinks, no, this should go to the Senate and it should be the Senate that condemn him. It's this legalistic frame.
That's exactly right. Right. I mean, that's exactly why. It wouldn't have bothered, say, I don't know, pick your random emperor. It wouldn't have bothered Domitian. It wouldn't have bothered Commodus. It wouldn't have bothered
Nero, that's for sure.
Constantine. Yeah, no, it wouldn't have bothered them to just take somebody out. It really did bother Tiberius. There
Yeah.
had to be a process. He really did believe that. Um,
You talked about this sort of what looks like terror to the Senate, seemed like justice from Capri, and I think that's a great way of putting it. But there's a bit that to modern eyes, at least, is sort of very hard to bear, which is the execution of Sejanus's family, and in particular his infant children.
yeah, that's gruesome beyond any belief. The worst part of that is this story of what happens to his daughter. So there's a law in Rome, supposedly at this point, that says you cannot execute a virgin girl. And so the executioner has to rape her before he kills her. I don't know if that story is true.
Yeah.
It's such a viscerally disgusting and vile story. I don't know what we do with that. And I don't know that we can say, did Tiberius order this or not? I think he did for Livilia, who is the woman who's contriving with Sejanus to create kind of enough legitimacy that he might be able to assert a claim to imperial power. But the children, that generally is not done. And when you look at actually even Augustus, the children of Antony, Augustus not only served as their guardian, he used them, he married them into the imperial family, right? That's the precedent.
Yeah.
And so it is, I don't know what we do with that.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we could say, I don't know that Tiberius ordered that. I don't know that that was spontaneous. And I don't even know that it happened, but it's a really, really disgusting fact that ultimately, he has to own, because if he was in Rome and he didn't want it to happen, it wouldn't have happened. So either it's a failure by ordering something disgusting, or it's a failure by not being there to prevent something disgusting from happening. But that ultimately lies at his feet. And that I can I can explain away or rationalize a lot of what happens under Tiberius's reign. I have no way of making that any better than the horribleness that it is.
And how long does he survive the fall of Sejanus? How long is it while he's he's not just living on Capri? Because I had this idea that he was sort of this thoroughly gloomy figure who kind of locked himself up in Capri and didn't come out. But that's not strictly true. He does come out. He tours the countryside around Rome, but he never actually goes into Rome.
This is part of the lead up in the aftermath of Sejanus. He comes very close to Rome, but he doesn't actually cross into the city. And I think this is where I think the idea of, just there's something broken enters into it. There's no reason for him to do that politically. It doesn't really make sense. He goes as close as he can bear to Rome, because that presence is necessary to bring about the outcome that he needs. And he thinks it's enough to bring about the outcome that he needs. But he could have gotten that outcome a lot easier if he went into Rome and did it himself. So there's a limit that is, I think, an internal limit. For whatever reason, like in him, there's a line, literally, the border of the city of Rome. There's a line that he doesn't feel like he can cross for some reason, even though it would have been more expeditious and more beneficial to what he needs if he had done that. So there's something there that's stopping him. And because it's so weird, I think it's real.
Yeah. Yeah. So how long does he survive the fall of Sejanus? Because he lives long. He's one of the oldest emperors at his death. He may even be the oldest at his death.
Yeah, he lives until 37. And so he lives until the year 37. I think the way to conceive of this, and if we want to try to understand the world of late life Tiberius, someone born on the day that Julius Caesar was assassinated would be 81 when Tiberius died. So that's why he's like a fossil, right? He's like if you reanimated a mammoth and put it down in South Dakota, right? Like the world that he's living in is not his world. Yeah. He's a relic of a totally different time that nobody around him understands. What's always interesting when you're thinking about historical moments is as you age and your generation stops being in power, your perspective doesn't match that of the other people around you. And the world that you understand, it doesn't exist and it isn't actually ever experienced by the people who are working with you to manage it. And so the fact that Tiberius is so old and the fact that his view of how the Roman state should work is so antiquated means that it's not even a problem that he is older than the people running this. It's a problem that he is, in a sense, pre-revolutionary, and they don't know what that is. And I think it's also important to understand, like, this is an emperor who didn't want the job, who ends up holding it for 23 years. And so, Augustus is the longest reigned emperor until you get to the reign of Theodosius II, almost 500 years after Augustus. But Tiberius holds the title of the second longest reigned emperor for almost 100 years. Like, it's a very long reign for somebody who didn't want the job.
Well, it's a very long reign for somebody who was old when he got the job.
Right, and was worn out and didn't want the job because he was old and worn out. And understood, I think, also that his perspectives were not the perspectives of the people that he was reigning or ruling over.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are a lot of ways that the length and the extent of Roman history blind us to some of these dynamics that are human. Roman history is so long that it's easy to say, oh yeah, Tiberius reigned for 23 years. Except put that in a modern context and think about that, right? Like just put 23 years on, I don't know, the end of the Cold War. And imagine someone elected in 1968 who's trying to figure out how to run a post-Cold War era. It doesn't make sense. Or Franco is an example of this, right? Someone who's from one era who reigns into the 70s.
Yeah.
And the world is totally different. This is what we're seeing with both Augustus and Tiberius. And this is, in a sense, I mean, I know we don't have time to talk about Caligula, but this is why everybody is over the moon when Caligula takes over, because Caligula finally belongs to the world that he's going to be reigning over. And the sources we have say, everybody was so excited that we have somebody who's young and dynamic and understands what's going on.
It's quite interesting you say, that you contrast Augustus and Tiberius, because Augustus starts out as this sort of blood-stained revolutionary, and it kind of moves into this sort of kindly old man in sort of perhaps the Robert Graves has something to answer for here, but this defender of the state and much loved and father of the country, and Tiberius starts off as this sort of respected commander, the guy who gets things done, and ends up, known for his reign of terror. It's almost an exact mirror image, the two of them.
Yeah. And in the end, of course, Augustus kills way more people than Tiberius.
Way more. It's not even close.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So you mentioned John Matthews, who was my advisor at the very beginning with the Atlas of Rome. One of the things that John brought up when I was a grad student under him is, if you actually do that count for how many people were convicted in treason trials under Tiberius, and you compare it to divinized emperors like Claudius or Vespasian, they're worse, much worse. And yet you go to the Roman Forum now and you can see the Temple of Vespasian. You walk across to the Caelian Hill and you can see the remains of the Temple of Claudius. Nothing there for Tiberius.
Poor old Tiberius. He had a rotten time of it. You mentioned Caligula there, and I was just thinking, I was listening to something, and Mary Beard, the historian, she was asked which emperor Trump most resembled. She said Elagabalus, and I just thought, no. Trump is Caligula, because A, he's completely mad, and B, he has a fantastic sense of humor, and C, he has a way of just sort of putting his finger on certain points which everybody's been ignoring, and I just think that's Trump to a T. And I just wondered if you agreed with that or with Mary Beard.
Definitely not Elagabalus. I think it's interesting that they're picking young people, right? Caligula is young, Elagabalus is young. I would pick Vitellius. Vitellius is the third of the third of the emperors in the year of 4 emperors. He is a noted consumer of a lot of food, also funny, but also kind of not totally up did the job.
This is what I felt Trump and Caligula, because Caligula is always saying, "Well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that," and nothing ever really seems to quite get done.
It would be really interesting to take the Caligula of antiquity, the Caligula of Camus, the Caligula of Bob Guccione, and see if you can get Trump from combining the three of them.
Okay. Well, look, I've kept you a long time. That was brilliant, actually. I think we did Tiberius some justice, which maybe history hasn't always done him. So so thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad we could do that, and I think Tiberius deserves it. It's 2,000 years later, but let's give him some good press.
Now we just need to divinize him.